Good evening, everyone. I am Xavier Salomon, Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator here at the Frick. Welcome on this snowy evening. Thank you for braving the weather to be here with us tonight. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Rubin, who is a professor of Renaissance art at the Institute of Fine Arts here in New York. She is one of the great authorities on Florence in the 15th century and many other things in art history. So it's very fitting that this is our final lecture to do with the exhibition Bertoldo di Giovanni, The Renaissance of Sculpture in Medici, Florence, which will still be on till the 12th of January. But this is the last, actually it's the last lecture of the year, of the calendar year of 2019, and also the last connected to that exhibition. Professor Rubin studied at an impressive number of universities in this country and in Europe, at Cornell, at Yale, at the Courtauld Institute, and at Harvard. And she has been, most recently, the director of the Institute of Fine Arts. And before that, she was the deputy director at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, and also in 1997, the acting director of Villa I Tatti in Florence. Many of her publications are books that anyone working on Renaissance Italy and art in Italy in general have to read and are on everybody's reading list, and are wonderful, wonderful books, starting with her first major book of 95 on Giorgio Vasari, Art and History, and followed by two great books, Images and Identity in 15th Century Florence of 2007, and the most recent, Seen from Behind, Perspectives on the Male Body and Renaissance Art of 2018. She also co-curated one of the great exhibitions on Florentine art, I think of all time, at the National Gallery in London, Renaissance Florence, the Art of the 1470s, with Alison Wright and Nicholas Penny, which took place in 1999. And so it is wonderful to have her tonight to speak about Florence during the time of Lorenzo il Magnifico, which is really the period of Bertoldo and this great period around the 1470s and beyond in Florence. I would like to remind you that the exhibition will be open tonight after the lecture until about 7:30, and this is the time to please silence or turn off your phones. And please join me in welcoming Professor Patricia Rubin.
Thank you very much, Xavier, for that kind and generous introduction. And I also, too, want to thank those of you in the audience who've braved the capricious weather of the East Coast to be here this evening, when we can, for this hour, perhaps bask in the glow of the golden age of Lorenzo de Medici. And in that note, too, I want to thank Xavier and his colleagues at the Frick, Amy Ng and Alexander Noel, for giving us a chance to have an intimate and engaging view with some of the very important productions of that era in the Bertoldo exhibition, and also to congratulate them on the exhibition and the authors and editors and contributors to the really beautiful publication of that. I get no commission for saying this, I have to say, about the catalog, but which really will endure as a way of getting a glimpse into the practices, techniques, imagery of the time. Speaking of images, I do also want to thank Jason Verone and Shauna Rose of the Institute of Fine Arts, who have helped me to illustrate this lecture this evening. And here we start with my first illustration, the title slide, with this detail of a snappy terrier from a fresco by Filippino Lippi in the funerary chapel of Filippo Strozzi in the church of Santa Maria Novella. In order to introduce you, I'm introducing you to this terrier as the mascot of my lecture, proving that at least in late 15th century Florence, the Florence of Lorenzo the Magnificent, even the most serious subjects could be viewed with delight. We can actually trust Lorenzo's own word on the matter. In the commentary to his love sonnets, Lorenzo took the metaphor of painting to evoke the way that his beloved's face was depicted in his heart. He develops the idea by giving his criteria for a perfect painting, key among them being that what is painted should be by its very nature agreeable and pleasing to the eye. Lorenzo allowed, however, that tastes differed. saying that some like joyful subjects best, while others would prefer to look at battle scenes and similar harsh and warlike themes. But most important, he insists that the subject matter must be in itself delightful. What better example, if I get the right arrow, which I don't think I have here. Oh, yes, I have, sorry. What better example of a harsh and warlike theme made delightful than the bronze battle relief by Bertoldo from the Bargello Museum in Florence? Originally placed over a fireplace in Lorenzo's palace, it is among the delights that you can presently enjoy here at the Frick. And in fact, it's really one of the most revealing encounters this exhibition has allowed us to have. Discrimination is another pleasure afforded by Bertoldo's bronze, which, as Lorenzo well knew, was an inventive response to a damaged marble sarcophagus in Pisa. And here's the sarcophagus below with Bertoldo's response above. Appreciating the inherent comparison between the ancient and the modern work required understanding the qualities of both. Lorenzo is well documented as being at the forefront of those who understood the intendenti, and who could exercise judgment about such objects. For example, when after considerable effort and expense, he had finally secured a rare and costly gem, a cornelian intaglio with the image of Phaeton, one of his agents in Rome wrote to say that the greatest experts there regarded it as being of singular artistry and difficulty, praising the hand, the eye, and the intelligence of its maker, also noting the beauty of the cornelian, of the material itself. Now, similar criteria could have been applied to Bertoldo's work, which not only completed the gaps, or the lacunae, of its source, but which upgraded its value, being in bronze and not in stone. Like the precious cornelian, the material was itself of great beauty. Judging the merits of Bertoldo's completion of the pieces of the ancient sarcophagus would have been yet another pleasure for those who amuse themselves by puzzling over fragmentary inscriptions or ancient marbles left in fragments, as did Lorenzo, who, we are reliably informed, could hold his own against none other than Leon Battista Alberti in that regard. The relief was a potential addition as well to the philological parlor games that went on around Lorenzo's dinner table, and it was located in a room equipped for such gatherings. That said, the sculpture is essentially or categorically different from the venerated but flawed texts that were so earnestly being recovered and reintegrated by the learned men of Lorenzo's circle. Not only simply because it's an image and not a text, but on account of its relation to its compromised source, which it does not restore. Rather, it is a variation on a theme. Bertoldo adopted the topic of battle or battling proposed by the sarcophagus and developed it. His work is warlike rather than being the story of a given war or even a specific type of combat, like the Romans defeating barbarians of ancient works or of his model. Although framed by victories and captives, the melee is a virtuoso display of ferocious and deadly energy. Helmeted horsemen charge forth, clubbing, twisting, and turning nude foot soldiers, who answer with equal vigor. The central figure, which is entirely of Bertoldo's imagining, as you remember, the center of the sarcophagus was lacking, bedecked with lion skin and wielding a club, is Herculean, if not actually Hercules, and indicates that heroism is being celebrated. The manly virtues embodied in Hercules were associated with civic valor in Renaissance Florence. Having Hercules over the fireplace recalled that association and indeed echoed the large canvases with the labors of Hercules that hung in the big sala or great hall next door to the room in which this battle piece was displayed. It is well to ask, however, just what form of legibility Bertoldo sought to create in his battle piece. Could he have expected it to have been the object of close examination? Or did he intend it to become the subject of a more generalized appreciation of his ingenuity and skill, demonstrating his mastery of energetic form and his ability not only to repair the damaging effects of time, and that's really a quote from a letter between humanists about text, the damaging effects of time that needed to be repaired, but actually to reverse them through his own powers of invention. In the flickering light of the saletta, the dining room, diners may well indeed have been distracted as much by the enormous 12-branch brass chandelier decorated with figures and foliage hanging over their heads as attracted to engage in lengthy, learned conversations about the battling bodies over the fireplace. So we have to think about distractions and attentions in this regard. But he gave people plenty to think about should they want to. That is not what I've said about the competition between huge chandeliers and battle reliefs to diminish the value of Bertoldo's relief to us or to Lorenzo, but to put it into the context of his magnificence, his sponsorship of artistic bravura, and the promotion of the learned arts. It is also to advise viewer discretion when considering the various ways that delight could be designed in Florence during Lorenzo's lifetime, and about what forms of attention might be courted, might having been being courted. Now, Lorenzo's imprint on that era is registered in Giorgio Vasari's opening to his mid-16th century biography of Sandro Botticelli, where he gave Lorenzo the pride of place. And this is a detail from a picture by Botticelli, which I'll show you in a moment. Vasari says, in the time of the magnificent Lorenzo de Medici, truly a golden age for men of talent, there also flourished Alessandro, called Botticelli. The cocky young man looking outwards from the crowd gathered in the adoration of the infant Christ in the painting now in the Uffizi has been identified as a self-portrait of the artist. He stands among the Medici, and here is the painting, two of whom, Cosimo del Vecchio and Piero di Cosimo, have been given the role of kings. And he stands among their supporters, a peacock gracefully perched on the ruined wall behind him. Thus portrayed, Botticelli put himself confidently in the train of the Magnifico, who is identifiable as the contemplative and richly dressed man standing above the youngest king. That position was probably, Botticelli's position, was probably more a pious hope than actual fact in what was an early stage of his career. But his painted proximity to the Medici illustrates the truth behind Vasari's statement, connecting Botticelli's career with the flourishing of the arts in Lorenzo's time. A few years later, Botticelli produced the painting which has become an icon of that time, the Primavera, now shown in its present setting, being venerated by some contemporary viewers. Despite its familiarity, there is no consensus as to how the picture should be best understood, or even what it should properly be called. One scholar, whose book on the subject is now in its 6th edition, has called it one of the most puzzling paintings in the history of art. It certainly is one of the most puzzled over paintings in that history. There have been, on the average, at least one solution to its meaning published each year in the past 100 years, with the pace accelerating as we come to our day. Indeed, for some reason, I seem to receive notice of a new article each day in my email, so there you go. You know, it's the question, who's there, what they're doing, what the source is, what it might mean, is it a myth, is it well, all sorts of things. Anyway, the problem is compounded by the fact that history has left few clues. The first known mention of the picture is in the inventory of the palace belonging to Lorenzo the Magnificent's cousin, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco, an inventory taken when the co-owner of the palace, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco's brother, Giovanni, died in 1498. A picture on wood with 9 figures of men and women is noted above a daybed. No artists are mentioned in the inventory, so the omission of the artist is not very particular. Now, the inventory taker was definitely not a dedicated connoisseur or budding art historian, but a person with literally thousands of objects to list and to value, from forks to the finest fabrics, and from ceiling to cellar in 4 villas in the town palace. So no wonder that he gave this painting just a body count so you'd know what it was. He did, however, it was, however, recognized as being worth a relatively high value. It ranked among the most expensive paintings in the inventory. The next mention of the painting occurs in the first 1550 edition of Vasari's Lives of the Artist, where he describes 2 pictures of Venus in Duke Cosimo's villa, his present patron, Duke Cosimo's villa at Castello. One, the birth of Venus, with the breezes and winds, wafting her to shore, and another Venus adorned with the flowers by the Graces, symbolizing the spring. Dinotando is the word he uses, la primavera, and he uses the uppercase for spring. Vasari's short notice makes a significant distinction between the ways that he saw the paintings. The first of the 2 was a Venus who was born and then borne to shore. That is to say, it was a specific subject. For the second, Vasari uses that verb, dinotare, which means to denote or to signify something. It is one of 2 uses of the word in the entire set of the Lives in either edition. The other is in Vasari's account of the ignudi, of the nudes in the Sistine ceiling, where he describes them holding festoons of oak leaves and corn and acorns, as you see here, to represent the arms and emblem of Pope Julius, signifying, denotando, that at that time and under his rule, there was a golden age for Italy. In Vasari's view, Botticelli's painting was an allegory of spring. Now, with all due respect for Vasari, his interpretation is but the first published of the many hundreds to follow over the centuries. His description does have pride of place, however, in baptizing the painting, which, owing to the modern love of labels, is generally dubbed the Primavera. More to the point, Vasari was an expert allegorizer. Symbolic overload is the sine qua non of his paintings. So, for example, his celebratory posthumous portrait of Lorenzo the Magnifico. It's done in 1534, and it's now in the Uffizi, with Lorenzo's virtues symbolized by the masks that frame his image. They symbolize virtues and vices of different sort. They're so complicated is this allegory, if you want to understand it, in particular, that he did the owner of the painting the courtesy of supplying him with a letter to explain it. Anyway, as I say, he knew about allegory. Vasari was therefore in a position to recognize veiled or poetic invention when he saw it. His sensitivity to the categorical or conceptual difference between the 2 mythological paintings of Venus can alert us to some of the nuances of invention in the artworks of the Laurentian era. Now, you may rejoice in the fact that it is not my point or purpose this evening to dwell on the many meanings that have been assigned to Botticelli's 9 figures. In fact, we really don't have time. We'd have to take days in order to do that. But expect no particular revelations in that regard. Suffice it to say that love is literally in the air, blindly shooting his dangerous arrows. The setting is a garden filled with the flowers of spring, the season of Venus, and that sources can be found for the individual motifs in ancient literature, mostly poetry, and in Renaissance love poems, including some by Lorenzo, that imitate the ancients. But rather than go any further with that anthology, inspired by the exhibition, I will consider the creative environment that provided the context for Botticelli's and for Bertoldo's works. Now, the immediate context for Bertoldo was, of course, his place as a member of Lorenzo's household and a resident of the Medici palace. One early visitor called the palace a celestial paradise. And here is a slide. It shows you that response was fully justified by the sumptuous scenes like the procession of the Magi with the Medici in their train that that featured in the jewel box of a chapel decorated by Benozzo Gozzoli in about 1459 during Lorenzo's own gilded youth. And the Medici and their supporters are sort of leading the parade of the people following the youngest king. The palace became a veritable treasure house under Lorenzo, who was an avid collector of things rare and beautiful, like the figured bowl now in the Museo Nazionale in Naples, that was worth enough to build yet another palace. It was really 10,000 ducats. It was worth a king's ransom, and it was one of many things that Lorenzo acquired during his lifetime. Of exquisite taste to the last, an eyewitness recounted that Lorenzo died contemplating with uninterrupted focus and repeatedly kissing a silver statuette of a crucifix magnificently decorated with pearls and precious stones. He went out as he had lived. Now, the crucifix is now lost, but I can at least show you Lorenzo's death mask, which is now in Palazzo Pitti. Lorenzo also collected talents, equally rare, if not always beautiful. Among them, the young Michelangelo, and here, shown here, leading the young Medici boys up the staircase with two other tutors at the front of the procession, Angelo Poliziano. Poliziano was Lorenzo's secretary and tutor to the Magnifico's sons, and they are, as I said, following behind him in the mural of the confirmation of the Franciscan rule painted by Domenico Ghirlandaio between 1482 and 1486 in the Church of Santa Trinita in the funerary chapel of Francesco Sassetti. Sassetti was a Medici bank manager and Laurentian crony. And as I said, following Poliziano, or he's got to the side one of the Medici sons, the two others, and then two more tutors. Poliziano, philologist, poet, and professor, was widely regarded to be one of the most learned men of the time. He was an untiring publicist of his patron's wisdom, generosity, and position as the leading and most beloved citizen of Florence. And here is the entire fresco, and Lorenzo stands there to receive his tutor and his tutors and the sons, and Francesco Sassetti stands next to him with his son, and on the other side of him stands another Medici ally. And I'll speak to you about this in a moment. Now, there were many ways of describing Lorenzo, not all of them as flattering as Poliziano's, but none doubted his formidable intelligence or his desire for the glory and excellence, or for glory and excellence, which, to quote the early 16th century historian Francesco Guicciardini, caused him to strive to make Florence of his time, the Florence of his time, stand out above all other Italian cities in arts and skills. Lorenzo largely succeeded in that ambition, with Florentine architects, painters, sculptors, and engineers in demand throughout Italy and beyond, with Lorenzo's recommendations frequently requested. Lorenzo also succeeded in promoting a form of modern and very Florentine all'antica magnificence as a civic virtue, essential to the city's identity and its imagery. So, in the confirmation scene that I'm showing you, the story of Francis being received by the Pope, Pope Honorius III, which took place in Rome in 1223, is embedded in the story of the just rule of Florence by Lorenzo and his allies, like Francesco Sassetti and Antonio Pucci, also shown there. And then Sassetti's older sons are showed standing opposite them. The parallel rules, that of the Franciscan rule and the rule of Florence, are also represented in this fresco. The mural was designed, and this was a very pointed perspective in the Florence of the 1480s. The mural was designed, and not long after peace was concluded between the papacy and Florence in December. So you have the papacy doing one thing and Florence being the setting. So it's been transformed or translated to a pseudo-Rome in the Piazza della Signoria of Florence. And I also wonder how the Medici boys felt as they had to trail along behind their tutors with all these other young kids getting to play around in front of the Palazzo Signoria. But that's what happens if you're the son of the ruling man of Florence. Got to pay attention to your teachers. Anyway, the piece that had followed this conspiracy of 1478 that had attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and had succeeded in murdering his brother, known from its ringleaders in Florence as the Pazzi conspiracy. Poliziano's conspicuous presence in this celebration of civic and dynastic power and his actual role in devising the chapel's program indicate the importance that was given to learning in defining and justifying that power and its essential role in the city's prestige. Maestro della bottega, master or boss of the shop, was one metaphor applied to Lorenzo's political arte, or his skill, and his style of ruling the unruly republic was deemed to be extremely artful. The title is useful, that of being the master of the shop, because it is a reminder of Lorenzo's economy of excellence, his trade in the city's reputation in all the arts, and that trade depended on actual structures of workshop practice. Those included partnerships, affiliations, exchanges of expertise, and hierarchies of activities. All were controlled by a given master, but they existed within networks of neighborhood loyalties, of familial and political ties, of patronage and of friendship. That complex of relationships is at least one key to unlocking the occasionally puzzling but most often intriguing inventions of the time. Invention, like its results, has its intricacies. It has at least 3 senses that were common in the period, and none were mutually exclusive. One of that is of discovering or making something new, a type of object, for example, like the bronze statuette. And here's 2 views of the Bellerophon taming Pegasus from Vienna that you can now see in the exhibition, both sides, or a monumental painting of a poetic or pagan subject, like Botticelli's Springtime Garden. Those were new inventions as types of works of art. But inventions, then as now, could also be technical or technological, like printing and printmaking. Antonio del Poleolo, for example, famously made himself even more famous by publishing his mastery of the nude and his vigorous graphic style in an engraving of unprecedented size with a display of muscle-bound men fighting each other to death. That he did so, signing his name, you see there, with a Latin inscription on this kind of epitaph tablet, proves that he was also inventing an identity as a modern artist who was fluent in the classical idiom and fully deserving to be classed with the great artists of antiquity. Another example of a relatively new technology or technical invention resulting in inventive design is the deluxe printed edition of Dante's Divine Comedy, with a commentary by the humanist Cristoforo Landino, which I show you on the first page of the Inferno here. The edition was one of the major cultural productions of the later 15th century. Published in 1481, its stated purpose was to prove the excellence of Florence in learning, in eloquence, and in all of the arts. With Dante restored to Florence as the supreme example. Dante had, of course, died in exile, but Lorenzo was doing his best to get his body back. Anyway, the commentary was intended to match eloquence with elegance and to vie with the prestigious manuscripts. It was also intended to have an illustration to each canto and to be engraved on the page, which was another technical feat of the time. A visual rubric similar to those of illuminated books. Botticelli was charged with the task of designing, but not printing, the storie, as they were called in the contract between the publishing partners. He matched his ambitions to those of the commentator and the printer by managing to give pictorial form to the entire narrative of each canto, even in the compressed space allowed. In the picture to the first canto of Inferno, Dante appears at the viewer's left, in the midst, nel mezzo, of the dark and dense wood, lost and dejected. He is depicted emerging from the shadowed forest, the selva oscura, and looking upwards. So one Dante in the next vignette, he looks upward, illustrating the moment when his fear was momentarily dispelled by looking towards the hilltop clothed by the sun's rays. The linear and triangular form that Botticelli gave to those rays was both correct, according to the optical science of the time, and corresponded to Dante's verse describing how their light leads men straight along the road, so the straight lines there. The viewer right half of the image shows Dante being confronted and attacked by the three vicious beasts symbolizing the sins of lust, pride, and avarice, the leopard, the lion, and the she-wolf. Running downwards with billowing robes and seen from the back, Dante is positioned for the central encounter with Virgil, his master and guide, who is seen trembling up the steep climb. So he really does manage to get the entire canto in that the design for that space. But Botticelli's synthetic approach, which had never been done before, his synthetic approach to the verses went far beyond the traditional episodic mode of illustration. It shows him to have been a penetrating reader of Dante and therefore able to involve the poem's readers in the pilgrim Dante's journey into the depths of hill with dizzying kinetic skill and remarkable spatial inventiveness. He invented spaces that suited each of the cantos he was illustrating, and in the airless space of Inferno, for example. So in his rendering of the 11th canto of the Inferno, he placed the two poets exactly as described in the poem, at the topmost edge of a high bank, made by great broken stones, where they come to a great tomb with its inscription, where Virgil says that they should delay their descent to become accustomed to the foul stench. And so they are seated upon these stones. Dante does not want to lose time, and Virgil answers that he's thought of it, and then embarks on a description of the layout of hell, which is the subject of the entire canto. Their conversation, Virgil's instruction, and Dante's sometimes bewildered attention are figured in the way that also conveys the intensity and intimacy of their relationship, the mutual affection that is the emotional motor of the journey. I mean, this is really, I think, just one of the most remarkable inventions ever. And he doesn't diagram, he doesn't play with the theology, he just plays with what's happening between the protagonists. And it's also important in terms of what learning is happening, that Dante really did know Botticelli really did know Dante. He was a reader of Dante. He was a vernacular reader. He was illiterate in a Renaissance sense, which literate meant you had to know Latin and Greek and be able to read and write in it. But he was literate in our sense and a great reader, as were some of the other artists that, within their capacity, that were the inventors in Lorenzo's Florence. Litigation between the publishing partners meant that the engravings were made for only the first 19 cantos of the Inferno, but Botticelli was later given the chance to illustrate the entire poem in drawings for a manuscript project. Like the Pollaiolo print, the case of the 1481 Dante engravings is an example of a technical invention that intersected with artistic invention and the invention of the artist's identity. For Botticelli, that of becoming the Dante of design. Botticelli's illustrations also illustrate a second, more conceptual meaning of invention, that of artistic inventiveness or creative invention expressed through the medium of design, or disegno. Disegno, or design, like invention, is a multidimensional term. It can mean the plan or the intention, and/or it can mean the actual design, and/or the activity of designing, that is, drawing. Botticelli's Dante illustrations to the 1481 commentary involved him designing the narrative, undoubtedly through a process of drafting, and then handing over a drawing to the engraver, or more likely, engravers. Botticelli was a prolific designer in this sense. He supplied designs for engravings, embroideries, manuscript illuminations, ceramics, and intarsia work. And this is, sorry, this slide is somewhat pixelated. It's a much more beautiful object than I'm showing you. For example, the portrait of Dante that is on a door between two meeting rooms in the city's governing palace. It was done in 1478 and was executed by the woodworkers Giuliano da Maiano and someone known as Francione, who were two Lorenzo stalwarts. When pressed for time or juggling commissions, Botticelli also supplied designs for paintings to assistants, or he subcontracted painters from other shops. Botticelli was not only a leading painter, he was also a maestro di disegno, a master designer, whose inventions were in constant demand for much of his career. That category of activity or professional designation, that of being a master of design, was special to Florence, where collaboration and crossover between crafts were common practices. The multitasking shops, or botteghe, of the sculptor, painter, goldsmiths Andrea del Verrocchio and of the Poleolo brothers epitomize the overlapping modes of production characteristic of the city. The list of works that Verrocchio did for the Medici family, and here the Medici emblem from the tomb of Lorenzo's father and uncle in San Lorenzo, includes a painting of the Fair Lady of Lorenzo's sonnets, and works in bronze, marble, terracotta, and porphyry. It includes large-scale statues, relief sculpture, fountain figures, banners, and helmet figures for jousts, two magnificent tombs in San Lorenzo, and the restoration of ancient sculpture. And I would note that because we're presently in the domain of Bertoldo, I have refrained from illustrating very much by Verrocchio. However, it was really Verrocchio, not Bertoldo, who took over Donatello's role as the principal sculptor for the family. His relationship to their patronage, however, was different from that of either Donatello's or Bertoldo's. Verrocchio was not one of the familiares, the members of the household, as was Bertoldo, or even a protected friend in the technical sense of the time. He was a respected and trusted employee. The difference may derive, at least in part, from the scale and scope of Verrocchio's multitasking and multimedia enterprise, which, of course, you will remember also included the young Leonardo among his workshop. The Poleolo brothers' partnership was no less diverse than Verrocchio's in its output. Antonio was trained as a goldsmith, but with his brother received highly prestigious large-scale sculptural and painting commissions, and here is one of them. This is the altarpiece for the suitably grandiose funerary chapel of the grandson of the King of Portugal, Cardinal James of Lusitania, who died in Florence in 1459. And the painting was commissioned in about 1466 and is now in the Uffizi, and it was part of really one of Florence's, most regal chapel decorations. In it, the cardinal's name saint, James, stands on a form of parapet between Saints Vincent and Eustace. Behind them are glimpses of a panoramic view, resembling or representing the Arno River Valley. And you see this is a recurrent theme to bring the past into the Florentine ambient, the Florentine present. It is as though the saints have come lavishly dressed for the occasion, to intercede for the soul of the dead cardinal, standing on a pavement of opulent stone, red and green porphyry. This ensemble of fictive materials, which includes, the rope behind them, it's sort of a rope done in metal, so it's a painting that presents the fiction of a fiction of a fiction. So this sort of huge interplay is a tribute, really, to the goldsmiths' work, the sort of their attention to surface, to sculptural detail, but also they have this command of space and spatial illusion. Their combined artistry, and I'll show you also a wonderful, this is how you get dressed if you're coming to a cardinal's funeral. You wear a wonderful fur hat with jewels on it. Was far from confined to a mastery of the nude in action. The Poleolo brothers' artistry encompassed employing another technical invention, indeed, oil paint, which was just beginning to supplement or supplant the traditional tempera of Florentine painting. The fluidity between the arts, or the arti, was particular to Florence. The guild structure there was not as restrictive as elsewhere, owing to its relation to the political organization of the city. It was necessary for the political government, which is almost as complicated as explaining Botticelli's Primavera, which I will not do, but it depended on having 7 major and 14 minor guilds, some combining professions, like the Guild of the Doctors and Druggists, which also enrolled painters. The result was that sculptors, you could also cross-register, which was really almost, I think, completely unique. Sculptors could also be painters, goldsmiths could make monumental sculptures, manuscript illuminators could become mosaicists, and so on. In what was a very competitive arena, ingenuity and skill were more important than being a card-carrying member of a specific guild. There was a premium on being inventive. A third and equally important definition of invention comes from rhetoric. Invention, or inventio, is the first of the 3 principal parts of oratory, followed by disposition and elocution. In its rhetorical sense, invention consisted of the discovery of the argument from which all else followed. For artists, the argument or subject matter could and did come from well-known secular sources like Dante's poem, or tales from Boccaccio, or from ancient history, or it might be freshly minted by a learned advisor. It could also be based on religious histories, most often the stories of the saints' lives told in the Golden Legend. That was the case, for example, for Filippino Lippi in his commission to paint scenes from the life of St. Philip the Apostle, among other scenes there, in his decoration of Filippo Strozzi, so it's Philip the Apostle for Philip Strozzi, burial chapel in the church of Santa Maria Novella in the 1490s. According to the Golden Legend, Philip had been preaching in Scythia for 20 years when the pagans seized him and tried to compel him to sacrifice to the statue of the god Mars. But suddenly, a huge dragon emerged from the foot of the statue and slew the son of the priest who was preparing the fire for the sacrifice, together with 2 tribunes who had arrested Philip. And at the same time, the dragon exhaled a breath so noxious that all who stood there were stifled by it. So on your left side, they're all holding their noses, they're being stifled. On the other side, the son is in a dead faint. Philip exhorted the crowd to believe and break the statue and to adore the Lord's cross in its stead. The pagans, getting sicker by the moment, readily agreed to the terms. Philip ordered the dragon off to a desert place where it could do no harm, and cured those taken ill and resuscitated those who died, thereby converting the whole city. Filippino visualized the story in a way that was both learned and fantastic. He imagined a pagan world, having studied and absorbed the formal and decorative vocabulary of the ancient works he had recently seen while working in Rome. He referred to the rhetorical devices of hyperbole and comparison in his composition and its style. He opposed the simple force of Philip's command to the overcharged grandeur of the altar to Mars. The artificiality of idolatry is rendered with exuberant artifice. The statue appears to be a living idol. It illustrates idolatry indeed, and menacing the apostle, echoing Philip's gesture to no effect. The unnatural pomposity of the altar, which seems about to tumble under its own weight, is countered by the break in the clouds above, opening to reveal a vision of Christ. The absurdity of false belief is pictured through over and understatement, the most obvious and diverting being the huge dragon, which has emerged from its hole under the altar to poison the assembled crowd. The monster looks more like a bad-tempered pet than a killer beast. Aside from compositional balance, perhaps its size expresses its submission to Philip's orders, but it's also a conspicuous element of delight, along with really what I believe is one of the few, if not the only, representations of bad breath in art. As I said earlier, the different meanings of invention were far from mutually exclusive, an assertion that is amply demonstrated by the medal designed by Bertoldo to commemorate the murderous events of the Pazzi conspiracy. A letter to Lorenzo documents that Bertoldo provided the model, the prima impronta, or proof cast, with further examples cast by an experienced bronze caster. Such a division between design and execution, as we have seen, was common enough. Uncommon, however, is the record of the executors, the executants, the bronze casters' description of the invention as being immortal and praiseworthy. The medal is also totally original in design. Now, being the owner of a vast collection of ancient coins and medals, Lorenzo knew that they could become valuable vectors of history. The commission, which came fast upon the conspiracy, really probably even within days, was doubtless intended to be one instrument shaping the record of the plot and folding it into a Medician telling of the story. The invention or subject came from the events of the day. Part of the imagery of the medal tells the story of the attacks, or rather, two stories. Both are set in the choir of the Duomo, where they took place after Mass. I put them both together, both sides. So that's the structure. You see the heads rising over. On the side portraying Lorenzo with the inscription Salus Publica, or public good, or well-being, or welfare, he is being bundled off to the sacristy, escaping through, off to your right, escaping the mortal blows. That portraying Giuliano with Luctus Publicus, public mourning, he is shown receiving those blows in the assassination, the successful assassination. The combination of imagery and inscriptions, of commemorative portrait heads and narrative detail, and of invocations to loss and salvation is eulogistic. The medal was part of the same strategic recounting as the commentary on the conspiracy written by Poliziano at the same time. I mean, there's a huge publicity effort going on to really shape the history. Lorenzo, among other things, had wax images of himself made, some of them wearing the bloody clothing, and put as sort of votive images around. People were not, and then there were some very bloody reprisals with caught conspirators hung from the palazzo windows. It was really an extreme effort to shape how the events were seen. Anyway, both Poliziano's text and the medals were conceived to publish this episode, and this terrible episode, and to do so from the Medician point of view, and both took advantage of appropriate technologies for circulating the story widely to audiences. One was printed, and one was the medal. Both also put classical models to contemporary aims. The correspondence between Poliziano's description of the handsomely formed Giuliano and Bertoldo's portrait of Giuliano is striking, and probably intentional. Poliziano records Giuliano's lively eyes and proud look, his flowing black hair thrown back over his forehead and over his neck, a handsome youth whose physical aspect corresponded with his noble character, quite unlike the abject and malformed conspirators that are described in the commentary. And notice, seeing the two portraits, that not only do they sport different hairdos, but their demeanor is differentiated. Lorenzo, sober and resolute; Giuliano, gallant and bold, a living presence in memory. Despite similarities, the two testimonials refer to diverse forms of historical representation, not only because one is visual and the other is textual, but because each developed the argument, the invention, according to different criteria. Each follows a distinct model of elaboration. Poliziano's is an eyewitness account. Its prototype and authority is Sallust's 1st century BC history of the Catalan conspiracy. The resonance between texts gave weight, or gravitas, to Poliziano's commentary. Bertoldo instead amplified, and that's a rhetorical term, or embellished the story and manipulated its elements with conspicuous artifice to reinforce its essential points and structure them according to the ornate rhetoric of praise and blame fitting to eulogy. As I said before, it is eulogistic. The conspicuous, conscious artistry of Bertoldo's and Poliziano's works is all the more remarkable because they were sponsored and realized in the tense and bloody aftermath to the conspiracy, when Florence was actually at war. They demonstrate that for Lorenzo, the eloquence of art and artful eloquence were fundamental not only to, to his cultural identity that was forging for the city as in his capacity as maestro della bottega, but to his political strategy as the de facto ruler of Florence. Lorenzo's eager acquisition of finely crafted things was matched by a shrewd sense of how valuable they could be to furthering his aims. Historical works like the Pazzi Medal, or in another mode entirely, poetic inventions like the Poleolo, Apollo, and Daphne, based on a story in Ovid's Metamorphosis, were created for a sophisticated audience, men, generally, who were well versed in both vernacular and classical literature, and who took delight in both ancient and modern art. The humanistic studies being promoted by the Florentine elite and their household humanists alerted them to distinctions of subject matter, of the kind of invention involved, and of the manner and style of execution. When Poliziano presented Lorenzo's son Piero with his first published book of letters, with Poliziano's first published book of letters, for example, he was concerned to defend the variety of styles in that book against those who might find them inconsistent. He pointed out that his intentions were not always the same, nor was the same thing suitable for every single person or subject matter, and that the subject matters, the arguments, were those that the occasion presented. The occasions and arguments were equally varied for artworks, and the variety probably guided modes of response. It is also clear that Florentine artists rejoiced in the stylistic sensibilities of their patrons, inventing distinct formal vocabularies and demonstrating equally distinct forms of technical virtuosity. So I remind you of the meticulously realized details. This is back to the Cardinal of Portugal altarpiece and the fancy clothing there, of the jeweled ornament and gold-threaded embroidery of the robes of the Poleolo altarpiece from the Cardinal of Portugal's chapel. So you have this, every detail finely done, individual brush strokes. And we go back to our friend, the foul-breathed dragon, which is just conjured up by Filippino with these broad strokes of his brush. So, and technically there were different, technical virtuosity of different sorts is being played out here. Now, while it is true that the erudition of the day could be almost intentionally arcane, it is also true that its proponents were obsessive about getting things right. The barbarians were at the gate, according to those defending the realm of literature and the liberal arts. That defense depended on detail. To that end, for example, Poliziano, I'll remind you of our friend Poliziano, and a friend in Ferrara exchanged long, heated letters about whether our friend Pliny had mistaken, now I'm not sure of my Greek pronunciation here, kythos for kisos in his natural history, and without going into the matter, I mean, there are pages and pages that go on about these two words. One was an ivy and the other was not. Poliziano's magnum opus, indeed, was an etymological compendium, and he delivered an entire university lecture to prove the way that a tense intention to language and its details could lead to nothing less than a reevaluation of the nature of wisdom and of philosophy. Civilization relied on the trash-cleaning efforts being directed to literature, and that's a quote from one of his letters, or a friend of his, a letter to Poliziano, and his like, or so one admiring colleague wrote to him. Such attitudes among the academics of the day, self-aggrandizing as they may have been, were also taken very seriously, and not only by those academics. Their patrons invested heavily in learning, amassing libraries to provide the best texts and context for humanist study, hiring tutors for their sons and sending them to university. And this was unusual. It was the first really generation of merchant sons going to university. Lorenzo, for his part, refounded the universities of Pisa and Florence and paid the professors, and those of you who are professors or know any, this is very gratifying, the highest salaries in the peninsula to boost the school's prestige against more venerable institutions in Padua and Bologna. Philology was not divorced from cultural politics or the political culture of Lorenzo's Florence. This alliance is exemplified by this fresco that I'm showing you, the Annunciation to Zachariah, in the chapel decoration by Domenico Ghirlandaio, once again, for the Medici bank manager, done for the Medici bank manager and Lorenzo's uncle, Giovanni Tornabuoni. And it sets the sacred story, as you can see, in a celebration of peace and prosperity of the day, with the gathered men of the Tornabuoni clan, their friends, and a clutch of humanists at the lower left there, opposite the young men they might be tutoring. Now, so how then did the encyclopedic command of ancient Greek and Latin literature and the commitment to right reading and perfect translation translate to the inventions of contemporary artists and their reception? Inventions, arguments, or subject matters that were often supplied or invented by, or yes, in some way or sure, invented by those same learned professionals who liked nothing better than showing off what they knew and others just might not know so well. And here they are showing off to each other in that lower left corner. That's Landino, Poliziano, Ficino, and Gentile Becchi, all humanists actually associated with Lorenzo's household. Now, some insight of what might be expected comes from the reports of a visit to the Medici Palace by a highly respected Venetian humanist, a man named Ermolaio Barbaro. In May 1490, Barbaro was wined and dined by Lorenzo's son Piero in the company of the likes of Poliziano, Piccolo da Mirandola, and Marsilio Ficino. Piero wrote to his father, who happened to be out of town that day, that after the meal, he gave their guest a complete tour of the house, showing him the medals, the vases, the cameos, in fact, everything, including the sculpture garden. And that Barbaro took great pleasure in the visit, even though, Piero added, I don't believe that he knows much about sculpture. I'm showing you actually one of these treasures that Lorenzo owned, and he did mark them with his initials, incidentally, as you can see. What was found lacking, then, in Barbaro's response to the sculptures he saw? Introducing Barbaro to Piero by letter, Lorenzo had written that he thought Barbaro was a knowledgeable man and one who takes pleasure in seeing antiquities. He was a persona intendente, he understood, and si dilecti, he took delight in seeing these antiquities. In his turn, Piero reported that the Venetian was elegantly spoken and peppered his talk with Latin quotations and mottos. Most likely, the true connoisseur, or this person of understanding, would be expected to acknowledge the beauty and probably the rarity of a given object, and then refer to other antiquities, perhaps complementing the collector's taste with reference to those works, the other works, the similar works, or by quoting authoritative ancient sources that mentioned art, like Pliny or Cicero, and which Barbaro, while he was busy dropping Latin mottos here and there, apparently had not managed to do. Even though the eloquent Ermolaio was taken to the sculpture garden, he was probably a bit too early to see the battle piece that the precocious Michelangelo was soon to begin sculpting. This is a battle relief that is now called the Battle of the Lapiths and Centaurs, and it's in the Casa Buonarroti in Florence. The relief presents a useful test case regarding invention, its intentions, and modes of interpretation. In the biography of Michelangelo that Ascanio Condivi wrote in the 1550s, largely under Michelangelo's direction, he tells how the artist was between 15 and 16 years old when he went to live in the House of the Magnificent, and he stayed there until the latter's death, about 2 years, so from 1490 to 92. In the same house, Condivi tells us, lived Poliziano, a most learned and clever man, as everyone who knows his writings can testify, and as who Poliziano testified to himself frequently testified himself frequently to others. Anyway, Condivi continues to say that recognizing in Michelangelo a superior spirit, Poliziano loved him very much indeed, and although there was no need, he continually urged him to his studies, always explaining things to him and providing him with subjects. Among those, one day, he proposed to him the rape of Deianira and the battle of the centaurs, telling the whole story one part at a time. Michelangelo set out to do it in a marble in mezzo rilievo, in this low relief, and he succeeded so well that I recall hearing him say that whenever he sees it again, he realizes what a great wrong he committed against nature by not promptly pursuing the art of sculpture, judging by that work how well he could succeed. There's a bit of irony there, but he's also talking about how he was diverted into painting. After nearly 60 years, in this account, Condivi, or perhaps even Michelangelo, conflated two stories from Ovid involving centaurs, neither of which directly matches part by part the battling figures. On the relief, one story tells of how the centaur Nessus attempted to abduct Hercules' bride, the other of how a wedding feast turned into a rout when a drunken centaur tried to drag off the bride by her hair. The Hercules episode requires a river and involves only 3 protagonists. The wine and lust-filled chaos of the second story has a much larger cast of characters. And a hair-pulling tug-of-war is the central motif of Michelangelo's relief. And it could be the moment when the hero Theseus removed the girl from her demented captors. A centaur, defeated, crumpled at his feet. The groom was from the tribe of Lapiths, and a nice philological pun has been identified where Lapiths, or lapithoi in Greek, are stoning their opponents, that is lapidare in Italian, while lapis is the Latin for stone. So this is a trilingual wordplay, which would have been the sort to delight Poliziano and anyone he could tell it to. That large stones are being hurled in place of the fisticuffs, flaming brands, ancient goblets, branch candlesticks, stag's antlers, and other improvised weaponry detailed in Ovid has been seen as a signature gesture by Michelangelo. Poliziano was experienced inventor in inventing topics. He told one correspondent that his free time was divided up piecemeal by demands for something distinctive. So much so that already you can see that every wall has been smeared by me as if by a snail, with diverse themes and inscriptions. It is entirely credible that he thought up something distinctive for his ambitious companion in Lorenzo's household. That Michelangelo recalled the instruction part by part suggests that Poliziano gave him a careful explanation of the story, or even stories for him to carve. Centaurs, part man, part beast, embodied the fundamental and fashionable question of the dividing line between humanity and bestiality, between rational being and irrational behavior. In Poliziano's correspondence, to be most humane was the highest of compliments, but its primal opposite was an ever-present shadow. No wonder, then, that Poliziano suggested a centaur subject for his protege, nor that it would also be one of those warlike themes that could be both instructive and delightful, and which also could be compared to battle reliefs from ancient sculpture. In the event, Michelangelo lost the plot, but got the point, or rather redirected the point. He did not tell the story, which is very lengthy. He compressed the action, and after all, the block is not very large. He created a tangle of idealized violence, displaying beautiful bodies from different angles, all poised to kill. The body count suggests that the centaurs are being defeated, which was the outcome of the fray. Humans, if not humanity, triumph heroically, but with brutal force. The composition allows for that paradox, which could have pleased Poliziano and any other of the understanding gathered to look at it. But the real moral of the story is told in Michelangelo's later conclusion. It was a successful sculpture. Its actual subject was his emerging and exceptional talent. And by way of conclusion, that is a moral that we might bear in mind when we puzzle over the inventions of the Laurentian era and wonder about the causes of our perplexity. So here we have 3 graces contemplating the 3 graces. In Seneca's first century AD essay on benefits, which is one of the textual sources associated with Botticelli's panel, in this essay he explains why there are three graces and why they have their hands interlocked and why they are smiling and youthful and virginal and clad in loose and transparent garb, as they are pictured by Botticelli. One reason, he suggests, is that benefits pass hand to hand in their dance. He then goes on to say, and the reason that Mercury stands with them, like he does in the painting, is not that Mercury's art of argument or eloquence commands benefits, but simply that the painter chooses to put him there, to picture him there. So there you go. And I thank you.